been hit severely here in Volusia County. And with us today, we have two women that I'm very proud to say I have worked with in the past. We have Tara McHugh. Tara is the Executive Director of the East Central Florida Regional Planning Council. That is an 8-county agency in Central Florida. Elected officials from all, not only the 8 counties, but how many municipalities?
78.
78 municipalities are represented, and it's the elected officials from those 78 municipalities and counties who form the board that Tara reports to. She's co-authored 2 white papers that examine land use impacts to rising sea level. She currently serves on the City of Oviedo's Sustainability Task Force and also the Stetson's Institute for Water and Environmental Resilience Board of Directors. Honestly, I think her biggest testament to the fact that she practices resiliency is she has 3 children, all in high school right now. Also with us is Katrina Locke. Katrina is with the County of Volusia, so a little bit closer to home for us, and she is our Sustainability and Resilience Manager. Both Katrina and Tara have been with their employers for close to 20 years, so they understand us, they know us, and have been doing a lot of work in their area of specialty. Now, this is how Katrina practices resiliency on a personal level. Katrina got off a plane at 5:30 yesterday, 24 hours ago, from overseas, where she spent her winter holiday visiting her family in England. And so I don't think she's recovered yet from her holiday and that long flight, but she's here, and we thank you so much. I was really glad that you weren't on Southwest. So without further ado, because I know some of you will be wanting to move on to some other meetings.
Great. All right, thank you. Well, I'm going to start by just giving you a little bit of an overview. So, when we're looking at climate change and we're looking at communities, because, as a whole, as a county, as a region, we have all these communities we need to look at. There are some impacts that are potentially going to impact those communities. So heat waves, rising heat as we move forwards with climate change, increased storms and rainfall, and also the intensity of those storms and that amount of rainfall. So we're going back to the heat waves with extreme temperatures that may occur throughout. And extreme temperatures, of course, can impact anybody working outside. And when you're cooling your home, you got to think about the cost of that to individuals within our communities and how they can cover those costs. Food security, potentially, with disruptions, especially to chains and networks throughout, and infrastructure impacts of food getting to where it needs to go. Water supplies can be impacted, and water quality from flooding events and from other events. And then flooding, which Sarah Lee just mentioned, obviously we know the impacts of flooding. And then also from the reverse side of it, some communities impacted by drought. Do I need to speak louder? Mm-hmm. All right. It's because I've been back in England. No, nobody listens to me. From a sustainability, is that better? Or do I need the microphone? All right. So from a sustainability side of things, so when we're looking at sustainability, obviously we're looking at the way we use our natural resources and the amount of those natural resources we're all using. And so this is something that came from our Sustainability Action Plan, the concept of sustainability, so we should meet the needs of today without compromising the needs of future generations. So, using what we need and not more than we need of natural resources and those things around us, and making sure there's things available for the future generations. And when we look at resilience, this definition actually comes from our regional resiliency collaborative, our regional resiliency action plan. So we like this one: the capacity to plan, sustain, adapt, recover, improve, and grow collaboratively regardless of what kind of chronic stresses and acute shocks they experience. And I really want to just kind of highlight that bit that we say collaboratively, because as we continue on throughout our presentation, you're going to hear about a lot of the collaborative efforts that have gone on in Volusia County and regionally. So, sustainability, prevent or lessen impacts to our ecosystems and our climate, and resilience, adapt to or lessen those changes that we know will occur and thrive regardless of them. So what we like to say regionally is we're bouncing forwards. We don't like to say bouncing back, because if we bounce back, we haven't made changes. So we feel like bouncing forward is a much better way of saying that we're being more resilient. So when I was talking about chronic stresses and acute shocks, there's a difference in these two. So those chronic stresses are the things that they're continuous, they reoccur throughout, and they really impact communities, and it says here, weaken the fabric. So there could be things like water scarcity, it could be aging infrastructure and changes that we need to make to that. It could be poor air quality in some areas, poverty and inequality, and thinking about it, lack of affordable housing as well. Just talked about costs earlier. And then acute shocks, so these are single sharp events that occur and they threaten the community. So things like flooding, which occur and maybe just occur once, those heat waves that we mentioned, and infrastructure failure can also fall into this. So it can actually be a bit of both of those. So, this one's obviously not here.
Oh my.
But it could be something like, acute pollution. Yeah, and then of course acute shocks could include hurricanes. So something to think about when we're thinking about resilient communities is all these areas. We need to focus on all of these areas and more in some cases too. So our infrastructure, our land use, how we use the land, what we're using it for, whether it's building or, we'll talk a little bit about green infrastructure later on. Thinking about the economy, because that's important to all of us. We have a thriving community, looking at transportation and making sure that the impacts to our transportation can be lessened, and we look more at resilience there. The natural resources fall into this and how we're going to use those, and we're going to talk more about this. Emergency preparedness, and then health, because community health, we're talking about air quality, flooding, all of those things impact health, and just obviously the mental health impacts as well. So why does this matter? Well, we talked a little bit about water quality, so obviously that's a big thing for us in our community, the quality of our water. Many of us do things that relate to water, whether it's fishing, boating, just being out on the beach, experiencing those outdoor events, but also we drink water, we use water in a daily activities. We do something called Imagine a Day Without Water. It's pretty hard to think about even getting up without water in your life. So something to think about. I mentioned infrastructure, so the impacts on infrastructure from flooding and hurricanes and other events that may occur due to climate change. And then those impacts to day-to-day activities, getting around our community, so that links back to transportation and our communities in general and the way we build those communities. Quality of life, just mentioned that. Outdoor experiences can be impacted, and things looking at the way we build for future generations as well as we move forwards. And the one thing I want to talk about is that fiscal responsibility. So if we do the planning now and we plan for future conditions, then we're being proactive in the way we look at resiliency. And then also we're being more fiscally responsible in the way we use that funding long term when we look at things like grants and opportunities that are coming up, which we're going to talk more about as we move forwards. And one of the big things here is, as I say, being proactive. It gets us from that recovery stage back into being up and running again, so it makes us more resilient because we're doing that a lot quicker if we plan.
So, what has Volusia County been doing? How have we been doing, reaching out across the county with jurisdictions within the county itself, across our agencies to plan for resilience? Back in 2015, there was the FAST Act, which was replaced by the infrastructure bill recently. That FAST Act required transportation organizations such as the River to Sea TPO to look at vulnerabilities to sea level rise and flooding on their transportation infrastructure and develop strategies in order to address them, to get federal funding. So the government was saying, you want money from us? You need to look at this. So we worked with the River to the Sea TPO to look at their transportation infrastructure, facilities, and and see what's vulnerable to sea level rise and storm surge, so they can start making some decisions in their operations, the way they plan their infrastructure, how they spend their money, and really what strategies they can do to reduce those impacts on those facilities. Around that time, the state also passed the Peril of Flood Act. This is a comprehensive planning act. Any community, Volusia County, or communities along the water that are required to have a coastal element within their comp plan were required to adopt policies within their coastal element to address high tide events, storm surge, sea level rise, and other flooding associated with sea level rise, and develop principles for how development within these areas or within the community would occur. State in your policies best practices that you'll be implementing within these areas that are vulnerable, including down to site development techniques. So this was told to local governments, you will start looking at future conditions when you're looking at developing your community. In Volusia County, every city currently is in compliance with the Department of Economic Opportunity, our state planning agency, in their peril of flood language within their comp plan. Holly Hill still has to do theirs, and Ormond Beach is, except for Holly Hill, who still has to do theirs, and Ormond Beach is currently working on theirs. But every community, including the county, is in compliance and has policies in their comp plan that address future sea level rise conditions and how to plan for that, as well as flooding. So we have been working across a number of agencies within the county. Like I said, River to Sea TPO, some academics, Stetson, UF GeoPlan, Sea Grant, DEP. They give us a lot of money to do this planning, so we're ever so grateful for them. Because we can't do it in a silo, which is what Katrina talked about earlier with the resilient communities. You have to be talking across disciplines. No one person is an expert, so you really need to bring in those expertise from outside areas.
And so we're going to talk a little bit about how we started planning with resilience. So in 2017, the first plan that I was involved in was the Resilient Volusia County Plan. We now call this phase 1 because we went into a phase 2. And within this planning document, we looked at sea level rise, storm surge, and 100-year storm events over on the east side of the county. So we were only looking at the east coastal area of the county and looking at impacts on infrastructure from those things I mentioned, sea level rise and storm surge. And so when you look at this on the right-hand side, I just want to mention this really, very briefly. This was the curves that we were using at that time. So at 2040, our high curve at that time would have been 1.22 feet. And this was the data that was available to us at the time of doing this actual plan. So these were the US Army Corps of Engineers, low, medium, and high curves that we used. Then this was prepared in 2018, but adopted in 2019. We worked through an East Central Florida Regional Resiliency Action Plan, which was a 2-county plan with Volusia and Brevard County, again, led by the Regional Planning Council. So a lot of the efforts you're going to hear me talk about, the Regional Planning Council have been involved in and have actually led many of these efforts as well. And so this plan looked at bringing a whole lot of stakeholders together. As Tara mentioned, you can't work in silos, you need experts from different areas, you need people who are practitioners in each field. And we did a number of workshops in Volusia and in Brevard counties too, where we did some actual activities and got input from, as I mentioned, various people in the community.
Quick question, how far inland is your so-called East Coast, when you described it as being applying to the east side, I thought I heard you say.
So we just looked at East Volusia County, so the
And
eastern side of the county.
So what we did was we modeled a 100-year storm event coming in from the ocean. So however far that water went was our area of focus. There was no data available for the St. Johns River. Since then, we've looked at sea level rise along those areas and where it could flood, but for this, it was just the incoming from the Atlantic. So geographically, nothing really went past 95, so it was pretty much 95
That's it,
and
yeah.
east.
And as I recall, Hurricane Ian, at one point interfered with, for example, Williamson. You may or may not, but it stopped traffic several days on Williamson because of the Spruce Creek overflow.
Impacts of
And I'm
flooding.
curious if your study went as far as Williamson, which is on the outboard side of 95.
So we're going to get more into that as we go through, because we have some future planning documents that we've done where we've looked at more current sea level rise projections, and then also looked at county-wide. So
Okay.
hold that question. and see
Let's
if I-
hold all questions,
Yeah.
and so that you can finish, and then we do want to
Okay.
ask questions.
Yes,
Probably
yes.
that is my brain doesn't hold.
I know. So maybe, hopefully we'll get to sort of answer that as we go forward, that's what I'm saying. So within this plan that I mentioned, there were 4 main areas that we looked at. So leadership and strategy, economic and society, infrastructure and environment, and health and well-being. These are all the things I mentioned earlier that make up a community, and there's some additional pieces as well to add to this. Another piece that we looked at, we had technical committees for each section that we were looking at within this plan. One thing that we did do is came back in and looked at sea level rise projections, the most recent ones. And NOAA at that time, they had just released that 2017 projections, so we utilized their high curve, and then we used the US Army Corps of Engineers projection as our low curve. So you can see that 1.22 there in 2040, and now our high, which was our high before, and now we've got a high of 1.85 feet in 2040. So just wanted to point that out. This plan also provided us with a number of goals and recommendations and things that we could do and work through to make our community more resilient as we move forward.
So using those new curves, because data is living, there's always new data coming out. There's always new storm surge data coming out when the National Hurricane Center says we're going to build new grids and now you got to rerun everything. So using all of this new data, we again looked at the future storm surge events as your sea levels rise. So, if today a Category 3 storm surge may hit a certain area, but if you put from the graph, if you put another foot of sea level rise on there, your surge is going to move further inland. So a Category 1 storm will impact much greater area and depth than it would now. So we looked at that. One thing we also did now was it's not just about infrastructure or your building, your development, it's about your people as well, and understanding where you have socially vulnerable communities and population pockets. So you're looking at you're looking at income, you're looking at age, those who might be transportation dependent, single female head of household, things that are going to impact the way a family can prepare and respond to a disaster, number one. Or you talked about heat, right? Is there enough money in your budget as heat increases to cool your house down? Do you have enough money to repair your house if you're not in a FEMA floodplain area and you don't have insurance, as this last hurricane showed? Do you have money to do fix the damages on your own? So we did look at CDC's Social Vulnerability Index, and what we're doing now at the Regional Planning Council through some funding from the state, we're actually enhancing this and working with UCF, and it's called the SOVI model. So this had about 17 pieces of data that went in to say this community or this area is vulnerable, and now we're looking at, I think, like 25 pieces of data. So it's going to be much more robust, and we're going to be applying it in some work that we're doing here in Volusia County, because all this stuff that we're talking about, we're currently updating again. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But it's not only let's do a plan, let's understand what our vulnerabilities are, which of course is the most important thing, but let's create mechanisms to actually change our processes and change the way we look at things. So this project was actually led by your emergency management office. And so they wanted us to look at their local mitigation strategy scoring system. So Edgewater or New Smyrna can submit projects to the Emergency Management Division and say, here's some mitigation, stormwater mitigation projects that we want to do. Well, we were looking at it in terms of, great, let's look at future conditions. Does your project take into account future storm surge, future flooding conditions? So we audited their plan, came up with some recommendations for them to implement so that projects are not developed in the same way that they are now, because it's not gonna help now, it gets destroyed, you wanna plan it for future. So, so we updated that. Back in 2011, the state, their first dipping their toes into resilience and flooding, future flooding, was the Adaptation Action Area legislative language. And this was voluntary. So it was, again, any community along the coast could identify areas that they want to, that are vulnerable to storm surge, vulnerable to sea level rise, and they want to prioritize funding and infrastructure improvements or other types of planning in these areas. A couple of communities in the state have started to implement that. Back then, Satellite Beach was the first one in the state. And so what we did was we worked with Volusia in phase 2 of Resilient Volusia to look at where are your most vulnerable areas within unincorporated Volusia County, and can we identify these areas as adaptation action areas, and what are some strategies we can implement for these areas in terms of growth and development and flood mitigation. So we had a lot of community engagement in that, which I'll get to in a second, but in this is kind of an overview of Volusia and all the hazards piled on top of each other. Okay, so you've got your storm surge, which is red and green and yellow, and then on the west side you have your 100-year floodplain. And so we looked at future conditions and the areas that pop out. Well, those are the most vulnerable unincorporated areas of the county that really need to be priorities for the county to consider. What do we do here? How do we plan here? It's the same process any community, any city can go through as well. And I would say that in Volusia, because there are so many, there are cities surrounded by counties, cities next to cities, that it really needs to be a very collaborative process, because you don't want to be doing something in one city that then is going to impact another city or the county downstream. So collaboration across the county is extremely important.
Thinking about the gentleman's question, and to help everyone look at this map, if there's a marker, can you just help us, show us I-95, show us where,
so you probably know
Well,
better than I do, but so
you
you
know,
got 95 right here,
yeah, going up.
right?
And then we've got
US
40 here,
40,
44,
I-4.
44.
Right.
and
So
so,
these
and
are
what
over
were you
here.
telling us the difference between red, green, and yellow?
And this is a draft map.
Yes, this is a draft. So this was red, category 1 storm surge future. Was it 2070? I think it was 2070. Green and yellow would be 2 and 3. So this must be 2 and 3 and 2. So those are your cat 1 through 3 storm surge. And then where it's hashed is I believe your sea level rise as well. It was a while ago.
Well, how about the gray? We live in the
gray-
gray area.
Those are cities.
Cities.
Those are cities.
Oh,
So it was really just to kind of pop Volusia County out so we could look at the areas that were
Pop the
colorful.
unincorporated out. It
Yes.
doesn't necessarily mean the gray doesn't meet.
Right.
Correct, because look at all up from, Port Orange.
And
Port
we're gonna,
Orange
and
up.
I think that ties into something we're gonna talk about, because we're doing, I'll jump ahead a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're gonna do a countywide vulnerability assessment. And within that, what we've talked about is with, so now I'm just gonna, we'll get to the head slides. So we're doing a countywide vulnerability assessment that's been funded through the DEP Resilient Florida grant program. And so what we're doing with the Regional Planning Council is we're going to look at vulnerabilities throughout the whole county with the data that we have available to us. So whatever data we have available to us to do that vulnerability assessment, that's how we're going to run it. So if we have city data, it will be included. If we don't, we can't include it. And then we're going to do an initial run, and then we'll do a second run, and potentially, although the time has got shorter in the time that's taken to get the grant application through the process from the state, and as we move forwards, we might do a third run. But each time we do a run of this vulnerability, run of the vulnerability assessment, we're going to add data. We're going to try and acquire more data and add to it. We're also working with a couple of the cities in the county on the assessment, because they're also being funded to do it, and they're working with the planning council. So this is the piece of like what that Tara was mentioning, that you've got the cities and you've got the unincorporated areas. So it's much better for us when we're doing these if we're working with everybody together, and we're able to just run the data and then just provide it. The thing with the Resilient Florida funding is, because now I've started, I might as well finish, is that it is going to provide us with the opportunity to apply for funding to the state for that Resilient Florida funding program that I mentioned. And I think it's 2024 that we need to be doing these vulnerability assessments based on what the state are requiring. And that I will talk a little bit more about. So, the sea level rise curves that we've got, there are some state requirements on what those curves look like, and some definitions of critical infrastructure that they're asking us for. And so that's what we'll look at, the impacts on our critical infrastructure. And like I said, as much as possible, we will run the data for the cities, because just like you said, it's unincorporated, but it doesn't stop. There's not a boundary, there's not a line there, there's not a wall there. If there's an impact in an unincorporated area and it's a city next to it, if there's flooding, there's potentially going to be flooding in those areas next to it. So, does that?
Keep going.
All right.
Right. So through this effort, we sent out a countywide survey to try and get some feedback of what does county residents and businesses want to see in policies and implementation, what's important to them when they think about resilience and the future. And we also hosted a couple webinars about the project to inform and educate, because nothing will move forward unless people understand what you're talking about and can get behind it, and as to Katrina's point earlier, why it's important to them, right? So I applaud all of you for being out here, and just encourage you to keep spreading the word. When you hear about things, grab a neighbor and go listen, or fill out the survey, or engage in the conversation, because your community planners or public works, whoever are implementing the strategies to be more resilient, can't do it if they don't have the buy-in from electeds as well as from the public. So we can't stress enough having communities engaged through these processes. So all of this planning, and I think this goes to your point, why do we do this resilience planning, is it really needs to help drive the conversation of where and how should development occur, right? Do you really want to pay for infrastructure to go in an area that potentially could be really impacted underwater, is highly vulnerable in 40 years, and then you're getting people out there and building homes and or businesses. So it's a huge conversation to have. It's a political conversation, it's a stakeholder conversation, it's a financial conversation. So all of that really needs to be considered, but again, you can't have those conversations if you don't know the information. And if you are looking at areas that can be vulnerable, really how are you going to make them less vulnerable? There are ways to build development from the building or the layout of the property using conservation lands for mitigation purposes. So there is ways to build resiliently and sustainably. And then of course, figuring out ways to reduce flood impacts on existing infrastructure. So there's how do we protect and mitigate impacts on things that are existing, and then how do we plan for the future? So it's a lot to unwrap, and it's going to take time, but as we saw, it needs to be a daily conversation moving forward.
So as Tara mentioned, these green spaces, one of the things that we have been looking at, and I'm gonna run through this quite quickly, so just bear with me, is green infrastructure, both at the county level and then also regionally. And this is actually a definition that we came up with for green infrastructure at the regional level. So it includes natural or living features, including engineered structures built to mimic natural features in look, and functionality that perform critical natural processes. So one of the things with low impact development and green infrastructure is to look at the way we deal with stormwater with LID and dealing with it on site, and this is something that we're sort of tying in with the green infrastructure piece. So to give you a very brief overview of some of the other things we've been doing, this is a 3-year grant program that we were doing with Stetson University through Sea Grant to look at land use, modeling future conditions and vulnerabilities to some of the open space areas within the county that we mentioned, Tara was talking about, and looking at it through that resilience lens, so the storm, the sea level rise projections, etc. And really kind of looking at how habitat might change and how ecosystems might migrate, and again tying in that green infrastructure into that as well. And looking at ecosystem services and, just backing up again, looking at ecosystem services and how those services that those ecosystems provide, so whether it is, water quality services that they provide, so that water percolating through that ground, and as it goes down through those layers of sand and whatever else might be in there, as it gets down into aquifer, those qualities, those pieces that tie into water quality, but also, maybe there's storm surge properties here where that is a holding site for some of this water that comes in, also from rainfall. So, and putting some kind of value on those ecosystem services. And then another project that we've done, because if we're going to talk about green infrastructure, we need to have demonstration sites so we can send people to them, because that's been a lot of the conversation as well, is Stetson University. We just supported them on a grant application, so we, the county, supported them on a grant application through DEP for this low green infrastructure project at Stetson's Aquatic Centre, which is there for anybody to go look at. So they redesigned a stormwater pond. It's absolutely stunning right now, so if you get a chance, I would definitely recommend you go out there. And then they also developed a rain garden as well. We've been talking about low impact development and green infrastructure for a while now. We applied for a few years back, as you can see, 2018 through 2021. Actually ran on a little bit longer, a 319 grant that looked at non-point source pollution, so that water quality piece. This was actually more to look at the BMAP for the Blue Springs, so that Basin Management Action Plan for the Blue Springs Springshed. We talked about green infrastructure, so the education piece. So this education piece is, as Tara's mentioned, is really important, because again, if we want collaboration and if we want community engagement, you have to understand what we want you to engage in, right? So that's a big piece of it. So a lot of what we do is really reaching out to the community and talking about these projects and what that includes. Another grant that we received through private grant funding, which is Southeast Sustainable Communities Fund, was to do a project with the community of Spring Hill in DeLand. There were a number of different pieces attached to this project, which included looking at best management practices for green industries, which again tied back to that green infrastructure piece, installing green infrastructure projects within the community. 2 resilience academies that we did with the community to talk about resilience and how flooding ties into that, and how you can be more resilient using green infrastructure in your community. Workshops, and then the last piece are really the Boys and Girls Club. We had a really fantastic opportunity to talk to our youth and have a summer program. It was like an academy for them too throughout the summer. And then community resilience team. So we've developed a team in this community which we continue to support beyond the grant, that talks about resilience and that looks at ways in which this community can be, going into the future, more resilient and what that means. So really talking to the community members about what they need, what they want, what they'd like to see as they move forward, how they'd like to see it being done, rather than us going in and saying, this is what you need and we're here to do it for you. So it's really engaging them and getting them involved as we move forward. And we changed this whole project as we went on, based on input from the community members. We were able to change pieces of it. So that's really important. Another piece of the education that's coming up, for those of you that might be interested, is Climate Smart Floridians, developed by University of Florida Sea Grant agents throughout the state. And we have another program coming up in February. So certainly you can reach out to me. It's easy to find me on the web. But again, engaging the community. We need to provide community with information and education that they might need around what resilience is. We have just, well, not just, but we've received a Florida Department of Economic Opportunity grant for $75,000, again, to work with the Planning Council and other University of Florida on LID ordinance recommendations, so that low impact development ordinance recommendations for Volusia County, and then looking at developing a guidebook for the region, well, for the county, but then that can be used throughout the region, which will continue to help us to promote and install and low impact development within our community. This is an example of LID. That's the Deltona Regional Library with pervious paving in the areas they walk. And then I mentioned this one already, the Resilient Florida Grant Program. The one piece I didn't mention, this is to do that vulnerability assessment throughout the county. I mentioned the gap analysis for any data that we don't have. You know, that's one thing that Tara's saying, when you've got, the more data you have as you move forward, the better any of this planning can be. But the one piece I didn't mention, and that's really important in this, is that we put money in this grant to do community engagement. So again, tying back to the planning piece, we want community input, we want advice and you know, any sort of specific stories that the community has on what's been going on in their areas are really interesting to add into some of this planning and the planning process. So one thing that we do know is that we're stood here talking about resilience. A lot of people don't know a lot of the key terminology. Some of the terminology we use is not everyday terminology, so we need to look at that too. We had, when Tara showed you the slide before of the surveys that we did, we spent a lot of time trying to gear that terminology towards everyday language, and it was really hard. And I'm not sure we did the best job we could have done. So that's the piece that we need too from, I run the community as well. Better language terminology. It's starting. We're waiting for a DEP signature. We got it today. I didn't look at my email. I've got hundreds of them to come back to, but we were trying to get that just before I left, so it came in today. So we have the DEP signature, so we're good to go. But we did actually, and this went through County Council for approval as well. So we have a short time frame now. Much shorter time frame than we started with. It was 3 years, and we're on
18 months.
Yeah.
So this,
so we have a lot to do.
in terms of a lot of what you're talking about, and I'm thinking about interested people, and what do we do? You know, we feel like, whether we're right or not, you know, we're not where we should be. That's probably how many of us feel. This is something that people like us could be involved in to help make a difference, move it forward?
So we're hoping that with this we'll have some different pieces, yes. One will be an online presence for a social media campaign, just to sort of start throwing out some language and some terminology and share with people why we want them to be involved. The other will be workshops, and that's the piece that definitely, you know, if you're available and you have time, and when we do these workshops, to be part of that process, because that's the point at which we'll talk again about how you can share this information with other members of your community as well. And I think that's the big part of this, is just making sure as many people as possible know what we're doing, and then we're going to have to really spin through. Sorry.
So we were talking about collaboration, and so East Central Florida Regional Planning Council formed a Resilience Collaborative. So before we had talked about that Resilience Action Plan, one of the big conversations that came out of there from one person at the port, even though we were all thinking about it, said, this is not just a coastal community issue, resilience as a whole. We need to include the inland communities. As you saw from Ian, I mean, look what happened in Orange, Seminole counties, as well as Volusia. So, so back in 2019, our board approved the RPC to form this collaborative for our entire region. And so this is just some pictures from our signing ceremony. Volusia County joined in 2019. We have, I'll show you in a minute, all of our partners. But the way we have our collaborative framed, if you remember those 4 main goals of that action plan that we talked about earlier, we combine those down to 3. And leadership and strategy, we don't have as a goal because that should be in all the goals, right? You have leadership in each of these pillars. So we focus our collaborative around people, places, and prosperity. That is a health and equity, built infrastructure, natural environment, and your economic resilience. And then filtered through all the work that we're doing in those areas, our goal is to reduce our carbon footprint, reduce risk and vulnerabilities, and increase our sustainability goals. So that's kind of the framework of our collaborative and all the work that we do. We are currently at 41 partners. We have local governments, county governments, agencies, nonprofits, academics, and we have 41, and I believe this month we're getting 1 more county on board. So it's growing every year. So if your community is not part, or you don't know, you don't see their logo up here, maybe you need to call somebody and we'll go out and talk to them. So we cannot thank Volusia County enough in supporting our collaborative. The way the Resilient Florida Grant Program, Senate Bill 1954, is worded is they do fund resilience entities, but you have to have a local government sponsor. So for the past 2 years that they've offered this money, Volusia County has been our sponsor. The first year we received $380,000 to do work, and this year that we got our signed grant today, we got $440,000 worth of work to do across all of our for all of our partners. So we can't thank them enough. Some things that we've done to date, and if you looked at, our partner list, the purpose of the collaborative is collaborate, right? Is to really build our capacity within our region, educate within our region, and pull in resources from all of our partners to move things. Like I said, nobody is one expert. So if you bring them all to the table, we can leverage all of that for the betterment of our community, and everybody can learn from each other. One community may be more farther along than another one in a particular area, so we can learn from them. So we've been working a lot with our partners to develop pathways to get funding. We are working with developing regional lists to get Resilient Florida funding, leveraging other types of resources such as BRIC and others. Last year we, so you can see we have a lot of different partnerships, not just with those partners that formed our collaborative, but our resilience officer has been really working with a lot of private foundations to secure money, and some businesses as well. So we're really building those partnerships. We developed a resilience action plan. So we have ours for Brevard and Volusia that's really focused on coastal impacts, but now we have one for our entire region, focuses on resilience and sustainability. Last year we were working on developing a risk methodology in partnership with UCF, our emergency managers, some health officials, academia, the whole 9 yards, and developing an assessment to look at risk across all of our counties. And this year, I'll say it on my next slide, is we actually got funding to actually do that through this funding opportunity. We did an audit on our housing, right? What housing is vulnerable to these future conditions, and developed a policy audit tool that local governments can take to look at their comp plan and their policies and see, are our policies really leading towards resilient housing and that housing infrastructure? Because housing really should be considered infrastructure. It's a community asset. You can't have a community without housing. Based upon the modeling and work that we did in Volusia County and looking at conservation lands through a climate lens, we received money to do that in Orange County as well. So, and looking at that for flood mitigation purposes in combination with obviously habitat protection. And then we have been working with a lot of our partner communities on a regional greenhouse gas inventory at no cost to our community partners through funding from the Audubon and a couple other partners. And we provided them an intern from a university, and they did all the work. So that's something that we were hoping to do again.
We have one for Volusia.
Yes, one for Volusia. And so we're hoping to do that again this year. So looking forward to 2023, continuing our resilience collaborative. We're going to do that risk assessment. We're also looking at vulnerabilities of our critical assets, like I said, housing. So we're really gonna dive into affordable housing areas, as well as waste facilities. That actually came up in Marion County in a conversation we had with them, and then when we started talking with all the other counties, they're like, yeah, that's kind of an issue too. So in looking at that, those vulnerabilities there, the same project we did in Volusia, we did in Orange, we're actually now starting in Lake County, and then through other funding, we're doing it in Brevard. So we're trying to look at, regionally moving all of that forward. And then I talked about that we had our action plan, so we're looking to move forward some of those things in that action plan through some trainings, create a climate action plan. That's Jennifer's deal. And then do another greenhouse gas inventory and look at and mobilize a committee that's really focused on heat. So that came up as one of our partner concerns. One thing about the collaborative, it's bottom up. Like Katrina says, we don't go in and say, this is what we at the Regional Planning Council want to focus on. We listen to our partner communities, what's important to you, what's going on in your community, how can we help? And like I said, the waste came up in Marion County, heat's been coming up a lot in Volusia County, your health department does a lot with that. So we're gonna try and move that forward.
And I just wanted to add before Tara moves on, to us it's really important to work regionally. Again, talking about the collaboration, but it also opens us up to some experts in the field that we may not have thought to work with or had access to previously, and now we do because they're part of this regional collaborative. We have some amazing people and the teams, both so there's the steering committee that Tara mentioned, that's made up of staff, and then also those technical advisory committees, or now just advisory committees, I think, as we move forwards, also requires staff input and input from various agencies within the community. And I think that's really important to sort of talk about that. And if you're, if you, from a city perspective as well as a county perspective, that, it's great to get those additional folks on those committees to help and provide their expertise and local knowledge.
Great. So,
We can just both. Yeah. So we're gonna wrap up where we were before we get into questions, and just sort of say, going back to this, looking at everything as a whole, looking at resilience, and the importance of planning within each of these areas, and then also, that planning piece comes into both decision making from a staff perspective, but also policy making from our local elected officials. So it's really important that we go through this process and that we utilize these plans as we move forwards as well. And I think you can kind of see from what we just showed you that we started and we continue to build on the planning process as we move forwards. And we were talking about this earlier. Is it totally comprehensive of everything we could include?
no.
So we know there's more, and we know there's more too, and this vulnerability assessment is going to be a huge piece of this as we move forward, and the work that's being done at the Regional Planning Council as well.
Okay, well, thank you. That's a lot.